like to welcome everybody to Ideas at Notre Dame webinar and podcast series from the Idea Center at Notre Dame. My name is Brian Ritchie. I'm the Vice President of Innovation and the Kathy and John Martin Associate Provost here at the university. Because this is a webinar, neither we as speakers nor the other attendees can hear or see you. So if you have questions for us, please use the Q&A feature within the Zoom app, and we'll spend time in the last half of this webinar answering your questions. And I would encourage you to begin asking those questions as soon as you have them so that those can queue up and we can get an idea of which questions are coming in. We're very fortunate today in this webinar to have three very distinguished guests with us and to talk about a very difficult topic, but one that is very timely and needs a lot of discussion, especially with a bias towards action. And so I'm very pleased today to introduce these three speakers. First of all, we have Philip Gaskin. He's the Vice President of Entrepreneurship at the Ewing Marion Kauffman Foundation, where he is responsible for leading the foundation's comprehensive entrepreneurship portfolio. As a leader with deep expertise in developing diverse entrepreneurial ecosystems, Philip also oversees the foundation's national strategy focused on eliminating systemic barriers to entrepreneurship and enhancing economic activity through inclusive entrepreneurship. Previously, Philip served as campaign director for national candidates, including Cory Booker for U.S. Senate and President Barack Obama, directing efforts in Pennsylvania for Obama for America. In these roles, he built and scaled grassroots ecosystems of volunteers who delivered historic results, aligning community, city, and state leaders to support policy initiatives. Welcome, Philip. Glad to have you here today.
Thank you.
Marcus Cole is the Joseph A. Mattson Dean and Professor of Law at Notre Dame Law School. Dean Cole is a leading scholar of the empirical law and economics of commerce and finance. He was a faculty member at Stanford Law School from 1997 until he became the newest dean here at Notre Dame. His many years of experience in the Silicon Valley area has given him many insights into how entrepreneurship works. At Stanford, he held 2 endowed chairs and taught courses in the areas of bankruptcy, banking, contracts, and venture capital. In addition, he served for 5 years as Associate Dean for Curriculum and Academic Affairs. Welcome, Dean Cole.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Brian.
And last but not least, Andrew Welters is a venture capitalist and entrepreneur with a background in founding, operating, and advising early stage healthcare and technology companies. In 2013, he founded BTLR, an advanced, fully customizable concierge service designed to enhance the experience of high-value patrons and fans and drive revenue growth in sports and entertainment venues. Andrew then launched 5 Lyon Ventures in 2014, an early stage venture firm focused on Seed Plus and Series A companies. Andrew and his team manage a portfolio of companies across the healthcare, technology, software, and communication industries. Andrew received a BA in history from the University of Notre Dame and was later appointed by President Father John Jenkins to the Advisory Council of the Idea Center. Welcome, Andrew. Glad to have you here today. I should mention that Andrew, as the entrepreneur of the group, is probably going to be the one who has the most in-depth experience on the topic that we had today. So we're glad you're here with us, Andrew. Yeah. So the purpose of this webinar, let me start by giving a little bit of an overview of the current state of the entrepreneurship environment. Entrepreneurs and startups have a sizable impact on economic development and growth. It can help eliminate poverty, revitalize communities, and as many of us know and preach, it is a driver of wealth creation. The problem is that these benefits aren't reaching everybody, and certainly not evenly. Entrepreneurship, and particularly the funding mechanisms for entrepreneurs, have largely been closed to minorities, with African Americans being impacted particularly hard. And let me just give you a few statistics here. African Americans make up approximately 13% of the US population, yet only 2.2% of small businesses are owned by them. By comparison, whites make up approximately 60% of the population, but own 82.5% of all businesses. Black-owned businesses are also valued 8 times lower than white-owned firms, and their annual revenue averages 9 times less than white-owned businesses. Compounding this is the fact that only 1% of venture capital dollars go to Black entrepreneurs. All of this has helped contribute to our economy's growing inequality. What we'd like to do with this webinar is address actionable ways that we can help increase Black entrepreneurship in particular, and in general, how we can create an entrepreneurship without barriers to all business owners to grow and develop their businesses. So let me start by putting out the question, what barriers exist for Black entrepreneurs right now? What have we seen in the past? And how can we move forward in the future? And Philip, I'll direct this first to you, and then let's go through all of the panelists for your perspective on this broad question, and then maybe we can drill down on this.
Sounds good. Brian, thanks again for having me. Yeah, you know, a lot of robust conversation today underway on social justice, housing, policing, education, jobs, and of course, health. And, you know, African Americans are dying from coronavirus at a rate 6 times higher than others. And, you know, with the shelter-in-place orders, put a particular strain on small business owners of color, specifically African Americans, just by not having cash in reserves. And so I wanted to start with the moment, so to speak, from African American entrepreneurship framing from that perspective in the moment that we're in. But let's take taking a step back, begin with the fact that nationwide entrepreneurship has been declining for about 4 decades overall, and meaning more and more people today work for fewer and fewer companies. But many of our policies today favor big business over new businesses. And the problem is big businesses aren't creating enough jobs. They tend to boost productivity, which means people are doing the same amount of work, but the actual number of jobs isn't increasing. So the need for entrepreneurship, the need for more entrepreneurial starts is more important than ever before. Entrepreneurship and small business, such a important integral part of the economy. But you asked about the barriers, and there are 4 overall, and we talk about this in our America's New Business Plan of funding, capital, knowledge, support, and support and networks, I should say, as well as a few others. And so we start with capital. Even before COVID devastated the economy, Black entrepreneurs were struggling already in this area. 83% of entrepreneurs do not access what we call institutional forms of capital. Those are bank loans or venture capital. And the vast majority of all that venture capital in the country goes to one demographic, which is white males, with only 1% going to African Americans. So that's about 20 out of $21 billion of venture capital, about 80% goes to those demographics. And then we look at it geographically, 80% of it goes to 4 states: New York, California, Massachusetts, Texas, basically 5 regional areas across the nation. And so that leaves out an awful lot of people. A subset of this is the credit market. A subset of this is African Americans' difficulty in getting loans to start a business, to start a new enterprise, taking that idea into reality. And so I always start with this part with my story about my dad. And when I was a kid, used to go everywhere with my dad in Central and South Central Los Angeles. He'd take me everywhere. And one of the places we used to go to a lot was the bank, or different banks. I realized we were going to a number of different banks. And I finally asked him one day, I said, Dad, why do we go to so many banks? You know, this is like the 3rd or 4th bank we've gone to. Why are we going to so many? And can we go back to that other bank, by the way, because they gave away the best cherry blow pops and lollipops I used to like. But he said, son, I'll tell you when you get older. As it turned out, the reason why he was going to so many banks is because it took him too long to be seen as viable in order to get a loan to start a business. So we were, because of the zip code that we were in, because of the color of his skin, because of his credit score just being a couple of points too low, it took him 4 years to secure any form of capital to help. And this continues on today, whether it's an urban edge, suburban, and rural. These type of challenges when it comes to capital happen. And African Americans are 3 times less in terms overall to get approved for a loan, less likely to be approved for a loan than others. So I think the capital one is one we can certainly start with in the conversation today, because it is, as I say, when you're trying to run an entrepreneurial economy and you're putting a lid on African Americans and other minorities as well, you haven't really found a solution for rural America and addressing this in rural America. And by the way, I mentioned 1% of venture capital goes to African Americans, only 2% goes to women. And so there are a number of different challenges as it relates to capital. I'll stop there and open it back to the group.
Thank you, Philip. I appreciate you framing those 4 big challenges. Marcus, maybe you could jump in and talk a little bit about your perspective coming from the Silicon Valley and what you're seeing there, and also your perception of some of the things that Philip has been talking about in terms of these constraints.
Yeah, so I don't like to think of the constraints as barriers so much as these structures that have developed over time and over the years. It's not an accident that the Technology Center in the United States is based in Silicon Valley, and that it remains in Silicon Valley. It's both the heart of technology development and technology finance. And that's because of a pioneer at Stanford during World War II, Fred Terman, who was the dean of the engineering school at Stanford, had the idea that a lot of the technological advancement that the Defense Department, or at that time was the Department of War, needed could be produced better in an academic setting than it could in an industrial setting. And so he convinced the Department of Defense to finance a lot of the basic research that took place at Stanford. And from that, you saw a bunch of technological startups generated around the Stanford campus and then in the Silicon Valley. And after a while, they no longer needed the university for anything more than talent. And as a result, the money was attracted to people who had STEM backgrounds. So what you have today are venture capitalists on Sand Hill Road and around Silicon Valley who, for whom personal relationships are critically important. They want to know the entrepreneur. They want to be able to check in with the entrepreneur on a regular basis. They want to know the ins and outs of the way that entrepreneur thinks, and they want to develop long-term relationships with those entrepreneurs to continue on into serial businesses after the first venture is spun off. So the real barrier, so to speak, is a structure that's educational in a way, because the venture capital, the money, is seeking out talent that is trained, and in order to get more venture capital and resources to minority businesses, those seeking to start those businesses have to have the background to be able to break into those networks. Now that's only going to happen if we have some real fundamental shifts in our educational environment to produce the kind of education that's required to participate in an entrepreneurial sector in our society, in our economy. And so that's one of the big challenges is not so much changing things at the end of the pipeline, but actually constructing a pipeline that can get access to capital for our entire society, for all of its talent.
Yeah, I love the way you put that. I'm excited about all the things that are coming out on the table in terms of things we might do if we're focused on how do we restructure the capital allocation, the networks, the way we connect people to the right mentors, and then to your point also, Marcus, how do we get them into the right educational structure and system so they learn this as they go forward. And Andrew, I know you as an entrepreneur are a big proponent of how we learn these systems, how we get connected to the knowledge. Maybe you could talk a little bit about your experiences and how you see that as being beneficial as we try to expand the access to different people.
Yeah, no, I think a number of really good points were raised in terms of education, allocation of capital. For me, growing up in a household that was kind of filled with entrepreneurship, my dad's an entrepreneur. I grew up learning about entrepreneurship, right, and the ability to start your own venture, right, and the process of going out and raising money, and also the barriers that come along with being a Black entrepreneur. And I think that I consider myself really, really lucky to have grown up understanding how that process works, right? Understanding how the relationships impact a lot of the outcomes that you see with these companies, across a variety of industries. And I think that there are just so many Black people, young Black entrepreneurs, because there are a lot. That's another common kind of misconception, that there just aren't Black entrepreneurs. There are a ton, right? But I think that there's a lack of exposure to entrepreneurship, exposure to venture capital, which leads to a lack of understanding of how the whole process fits together. I think there's a thought out there that, one, if you go into entrepreneurship, every day you're risking everything, every day you're taking a million different chances. And so the risk profile of being an entrepreneur, being in venture capital, is just blown completely out of proportion, in my experience, or at least, looking in from the outside, right? And so I think that a big part of this is just educating people on what entrepreneurship really is, right? What the kind of risk profile also is. And then also, when you look at venture capital, you have to, I was telling a story to you guys the other day, right, where I was speaking with a student from Notre Dame, and he was thinking about going into the investment space. And he was talking about private equity, and then he was talking about consulting and a number of these different things. And he was just so weary about possibly getting into venture capital. And I told him, I said, well, if you go into venture capital as an analyst, right, you're not going to be taking a tremendous amount of risk, right? You're going to be sitting there as an analyst. You're getting paid a salary, right? If you're not the managing director or the manager of a fund, right, the risk profile is significantly lower than people think, right? And all of that's just a result of exposure and education, right? So to Marcus's point, I think it's not necessarily, there are components of the end of the process that need to be addressed, right? But it's really at the beginning, right? When kids are in kindergarten, lower school, right? How do you start to foster that understanding and expose them to the process so they understand the value of being an entrepreneur, the possibilities, and also, again, back to some prior points that were made, the relationships, the interpersonal relationships. The last thing I'll say, and I'll throw it back, is that there's also a misconception, I think a significant misconception, that these companies that you see do so well, the entrepreneur, the founder, has worked so hard, and they've done this and that and the other, and they made it happen, right? And in some case, and that does happen, right? There's a lot of hard work and hours that go in, but there's also a lot of phone calls that get made. There's a lot of relationships that come into play. There's a lot of different things that happen behind the scenes that result in that company that was worth, $5 million one day and was worth $300 million the next day. And it's just a network, right? It's a club that is very insulated, right? And I think that if you don't know that, if you don't know the real rules of the road, if you've never been exposed to it, then you sit at a disadvantage. And that's where a lot of Black and brown entrepreneurs kind of sit right now.
I love that idea, Andrew, that it's a club. And the real question is, how do you get people into the club, right? The club has been exclusive. How do we get the club to be inclusive? And, the Idea Center, as all of you know, really wants to be an agent of change in at least starting with the South Bend Elkhart region to say, how do we create a hub of entrepreneurship, an ecosystem of entrepreneurship that is equally open to everybody. Everyone can get in the club. Everybody has access to what needs to happen. And going to your point, and also, Philip is an expert in this space, and I know Marcus has thought a lot about this, and you're bringing up this same point. Maybe we start at the beginning and talk about how do we get into the pipeline, the educational pipeline that draws people into that club. Marcus, maybe you want to start and talk a little bit. I know you've had a lot of experience in the K through 12 side of things, and an area that the Idea Center is looking at hard in terms of how do we influence and affect that.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. I think that one of the big failures in this area is the failure of our educational system, and particularly the K through 12 educational system. We are failing our talent in this country, and until we start to provide true educational opportunity for every single kid, we have no idea what we're losing out on. We don't know where the next Albert Einstein is going to come from. We don't know where the next cure for cancer is going to come from. So we need to invest in our K through 12 system. And right now it's broken. I've worked in the charter school space for over 7 years, helping to develop one of the most successful charter school networks in California. And what I found is that the obstacles that are in the way of getting kids educated tend to be ones of protecting special interests, like teachers' unions and the school services industries. They've got a vested interest in keeping things the way they are and are reluctant to embrace change. What we need are school systems that are geared towards developing science, technology, and math training for kids to be able to tackle the issues of the 21st century. And once they've gotten that foundation, they're prepared to go into the economy of the 21st century. That's not the only source of a pipeline. There are the very people that both Philip and Andrew discussed, like their parents who have experiences with entrepreneurs. And it's those people that we can turn to, perhaps not with STEM backgrounds, but with entrepreneurial backgrounds to partner with to help develop business and develop talent in small businesses. And then the one other thing I want to mention, particularly for women, an important source of talent is the serial entrepreneur. While we don't have a lot of women in venture capital right now, you're starting to see Silicon Valley venture capital firms identify talent within the companies that they've funded and pull out some of the women and minorities in those companies to give them some experience in venture capital and take them under their wing and engage in real mentorship. It's the kind of thing that Andrew was talking about earlier. It's those mentoring relationships that are critically important for building the next generation of small business and tech business and entrepreneurs.
That's fantastic. A couple of things before I turn it over to Philip for his perspective on this. Just so everybody knows who's listening today, the Idea Center is exploring aggressively an opportunity to connect with the local school systems to create and nurture talent in underrepresented communities, and would welcome anybody out there who would be interested in partnering with us on this. I would welcome your reaching out to us in this area. We think this is a very critical area and one that we want to explore and work on. We're also looking to your point, Marcus, how do we find those serial entrepreneurs? Sometimes we've had conversations within the Black community and also with women and others who say, I'm not an entrepreneur. I don't have an idea. I'm not sure how I would get into this space, to Andrew's point. And what we'd like to say is we'd like to help mentor you to that point. we'd like to help give you opportunities and let you practice on some of those opportunities in a very safe environment. Again, to Andrew's point, one that is not too hard if we fail, right? So we can fail forward. We can have opportunities to learn and grow and fail. So in that sense, we're also looking to invite people to engage with us in that area. Philip, what are your thoughts on this? I know this is your area of expertise and you spent a lot of time thinking about it.
Yeah, as we go into get close to Independence Day, one of the things I think about is our interdependence. And what we're talking about when it comes to ecosystems and effective ecosystems is being interdependent. What we're realizing in the country right now is a lot of information and things that have been there for a long time. We tend to come together in the moments of we unite, whether it's Great Recession or whatever it is, we unite and come together. And then somehow we become independent again and we fall back apart. And when we do that, what's happening is below the surface, the inequalities are just continuing to build. And so until we become more interdependent in nature from an ecosystems and systems perspective, the more challenged we're going to be. We can't keep, should not take a COVID and social unrest to understand what the underlyings are. And the other thing I would say is when we look at where the demographics are going, and economists say anywhere from 20 to 30 years, the United States will be majority women, people of color.
Yep.
And so those three large demographics not being able to get in the game to start and grow a business and to then employ people. So when it comes from a viability and sustainability of the economy, this is about that as well. And so when we look at the gaps in venture capital funding and other gaps, it's how do we all come together and understand that this is about where we all go. And the base of our ecosystems work at Kauffman is looking at the thesis is the more interconnected and more dense a network is, the more supportive of it is for entrepreneurs, the more successful that entrepreneur will be. Entrepreneurs are cast out there and they have to go through this maze in a community of who do I talk to, who has money, whatever. And there's no real roadmap. And folks are doing work on this. We're doing work and others at Kansas City SourceLink and others are doing work around this. But it's until we remove these systemic barriers that would break from capital to networks, to resources, to mentorship, to healthcare, and all those different things, it's going to be quite a challenge. Brian, you and I have talked about it. I do believe that the Notre Dame and the geographic area of where you are, you have that opportunity to really excel here from a standpoint of using nodes of the community to bring people together, understand what will it take what are the gaps, how do you move someone through and an entrepreneur from that idea phase all the way through so that there's economic growth and community wealth overall.
Yeah. I love your idea of dense networks and how do we create those dense networks? And again, the invitation to say, come and bring your talents and your abilities and let's get you connected with the right mentors throughout our network, which by the way is worldwide, right? I mean, it extends to every, Silicon Valley, Boston, Austin, wherever, and get you connected with the right people and deeply integrate you within that network while we're creating our local network as well. Andrew, your thoughts on, as you listen to this as an entrepreneur yourself, as you're building businesses, what would you like to see happen from an action standpoint? And how can we go about that effectively and include people like you who know so much about this space?
I think one of the things that always sticks out to me, and we talked about this a lot before the panel, right, is there's always a conversation going on, right? Maybe not the hard conversations, but there's always a conversation going on, right? But we're kind of at a point where I think you're seeing it in a bunch of different spaces, with everything that's going on in our country and around the world, that, people are done just having conversations.
Right.
Like it's time to actually do something actionable, right? I was reading an article the other day, and it was just talking about the venture capital world and how they're getting tired of hearing that they're not diverse enough and that they're not giving enough opportunities to Black people and brown people and generally just people that don't look like the prototypical VC. And it was interesting because the kind of the takeaway was that, all right, well, if you're tired of hearing about it, then do something about it, right? It has to be like actions have to be put into place. And I think one of the things that we continue to discuss is education, right? How do you foster entrepreneurship and exposure and education from an early age, right? So that does take capital, right? Which is obviously what kind of makes most things kind of go round. But there's a lot of this that is not capital intensive, right? It's more time, right? It's taking the time, if you have a network, to extend that network to somebody who's interested in entrepreneurship, somebody who's trying to get an idea off the ground, right? A lot of the work that we do in our company has nothing to do with capital, like absolutely nothing, right? Like our main function, right, is to make investments, but at the same time, I probably spend at least half my time just talking with people, right? And having conversations with entrepreneurs about their idea, right? Like before you make that investment, you have to go through the paces and the steps of getting to know that person, right? Getting to know their background and their understanding of how this whole game works, right? And so I think that it's just one of those things where it's not enough. It's just not enough to just talk about it. And I'm kind of dodging the question a little bit by not putting forth a specific action step. But I think that a lot of this is really focusing on having conversations with people. Because I think one of the things that we see is that because there is this lack of education and exposure at a young age, right? When you have Black entrepreneurs that come to the table, that come to these traditional VCs, and they're not as polished, they're not as, they're not as kind of put together in the traditional sense, right? And there has to be an understanding of the history, right, of what would have maybe caused that person to get to this point with a great idea, but not have, everything, every T crossed and every I dotted. And I think that unless you do that and have that historical background and context, it makes it very difficult, right? But I think there has to be a concerted effort on the part of venture capitalists to say, hey, okay, I'm going to invest in 10 Black-owned companies, right? I'm going to invest in 10 Black or brown-owned companies and entrepreneurs, and just make the decision and just do it, right? Like if it's so frustrating because, and other people could speak to this, you just hear, it's like, oh, we're tired of hearing about diversity, and we're tired of hearing about this, that, and the other. Who cares? Like, I don't care if you're tired, right? Do something about it, right? Yeah. And put your money where your mouth is, right? Is kind of what it comes down to, in my perspective.
Oh, great point. Great point. We've reached the halfway mark in time, so let me get to some questions. We've got a lot of questions from all of the people here. So first question, I'll throw out to the group, and we can each take a shot at this. Says, my company is positioned in a rapidly growing and very important market segment, but we still struggle to gain traction with government agencies or the private sector for one reason or another. There always seems to be a reason that prevents us from establishing, managing, and expanding our customer base. I remain certain that we can deliver exceptional results on a consistent basis. How do you enter the club? What do you think?
Policy and advocacy. I spoke, I'll start on this. I mentioned, and I'll drop into the chat here, our America's New Business Plan, which is a 4-point bipartisan plan that is to provide advocacy to spur policymaker activity, local, federal, and state level, to advocate for entrepreneurs. And there's those 4 pillars I mentioned before of knowledge, support, opportunity, and funding. What are and what we're talking about here falls almost interrelated into all of those. But what is it that why are they stuck in that position? What is it? Is there anything from a policy perspective, from a regulation perspective, from a support perspective, or something that policymakers, local, federal, and state, could actually be, bring some, make them aware of, and have them help for entrepreneurs? It's one of the reasons why we do our annual mayors conference on entrepreneurship, bringing together over 100 mayors that come together, that brainstorm and take away commitments and solutions, policies, programs, and practices they can take back to their cities. But it's not only at the local level, it's at the state and federal level as well. So many of those different types of those challenges that we hear. So we are hoping that there's 170 organizations that are now in a coalition, the Start Us Up Now coalition, that are actually taking it to the streets, if you will, not necessarily to the streets, but to the cities and the states and federal level, advocating to policymakers in their areas.
I appreciate your idea there about getting connected through, state, local, federal types of policies and areas. And I would offer to whoever that was who asked that question in that business to come and engage with the Idea Center, where we can help you identify what it is that's holding you back, help make the connections with the right areas. For example, small business innovation research loans that are grants, that are non-dilutive funding that can get you connected with opportunities inside the federal government. We have real access to some of those as well. So that would also be something we would say, please come and connect with us, and let's see if we can't help. Other thoughts on that at all?
So Brian, I want to agree with Philip there that part of what makes it difficult for those kind of efforts to be triggered by the private sector is that venture capitalists have limited partners, and they've got to generate a return to those limited partners. And when they are seeking to make placements, investments, they have a responsibility. They have a fiduciary duty to those limited partners to maximize their return. And that means that they can't take a lot of risks that government is able to take. And so policy is one way in which we can change the direction or course of the flow of capital. Another way we can do it with regard to the pipeline is an idea, it's not my own idea, it's an idea that's come out of Europe actually, from the rise of a couple of private institutions in Europe. And it's an idea that I call venture human capital, where you have a bunch of investors who invest in kids. And part of their investment will get those kids to the educational foundation that they need in exchange for a profit sharing arrangement where the investors will get a portion of the salary or wages from that kid when that kid makes it onto the market for a 10-year period. It's not something we've ever tried in the United States. I don't even know if we could try it in the United States, given our the arrangement of our current bankruptcy laws, which would allow a kid to discharge that obligation, and as a result, it would cause that market to dry up immediately. But it's something I think is worth exploring, especially for low-income kids who don't have the parents who can finance an education or finance a startup business. It might be the human equivalent of venture capital when it comes to startup companies.
That's a great point, Marcus. And even I think about, as you're talking, maybe the opportunity even of doing this on a philanthropic basis with people who want to really make a difference and say, I'll sponsor, a child of color from, kindergarten through 12th grade, if it's an automatic entrance into Notre Dame and the Idea Center and a STEM background and a connection to the ability to build a company and really change the trajectory of these groups of people early. Maybe there's ways to think about it there and then move it into an investment opportunity, if that makes sense. I love that idea. Here's another question. What are your thoughts on the necessity of mentorship, professional coaching for young professionals, entrepreneurs who want to not only enter the field, but also excel? We've touched on this a little bit, but maybe we can dive in a little bit in terms of how do we do this, and what do you think the impacts are of this?
You know, I start back at the education, and Andrew mentioned this earlier about when I go back and think, I didn't know my dad was an entrepreneur until almost the day he died. Never heard the word, didn't hear it in school, wasn't, and I look back and I think, had he known, had I known, what would have been different? What would the conversations have been? And so the mentoring and development starts early, and it's one of the reasons that here, one of the things we're doing at Kauffman is an initiative on real world learning in our education work. And so what are the skills, the gifts and skills that a student has, or what are the skills that a student can learn in order that are real world applicable? Because let's say they may, if they're not able to afford to go to college or what have you, or just college doesn't interest in what's being taught, but what are those real skills and how to mentor them and teach them on those things? I just want to give a different frame on that. I'll turn it over to Marcus and Andrew if there's any thoughts on that, but that's just one thing that crossed my mind.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. Such a big part of it is definitely starting early. You know, I think that, you know, so many venture capital firms have, you know, these venture partner programs, right, that are advisors to the firm, you know, but they also, you know, work as, you know, one of the things we've talked about at the Idea Centers is venture coaches, founder coaches, things of that nature. And I think that in order to kind of make a real change and create some real shift or transformation, it just has to start earlier, right? So you can't wait until somebody has a you know, kind of a business plan and everything together to start engaging with them on that level to start to give them that understanding of kind of how all this works. You know, but you know, and Marcus talked about it a bit earlier, just the interpersonal relationships are just so important. I think that if you know, going back to the thought around kind of a human capital, right, and investing in kids at a really, really young age where there's a specific track that has kind of been placed in front of them, right? I mean, that so much of this is just access and opportunity, right? And a lot of it's luck, right? But I think if you can provide kind of these roadmaps where you say, hey, this kid's coming out of, you know, is in kindergarten and he's got a sponsor that's committed to literally, you know, 20 years of sponsorship, which could include that person introducing them to folks in their network, introducing them to different mentors and exposing them to these things. I think that would be really, really key. I think that would be a big move, you know, for somebody to kind of step up and make that commitment. But yeah, it definitely just goes back to education and letting entrepreneurs know that every entrepreneur that you see out there, you know, on TV that's been successful, et cetera, you know, as much as they could take credit, it's like many other things, as much as they could take credit for, you know, everybody always applauds the founder who does really well, right? But I think the best founders are the ones who recognize that it is 1,000%, the success is 1,000% a result of the people you put around you and the people that have been advising you, right? And so a lot of it is just kind of having an understanding and recognition of the fact that although there are these prominent founders out there, there's probably 30 different mentors that they've worked with over the course of their career in order to make sure that they didn't, that they got to that point, but also in the failure, right? Because there's a lot of failure. It's a huge roller coaster, right? And not everybody's equipped for that. But I think that the successful entrepreneurs and predominantly white entrepreneurs have the understanding at a young age that you can fail and that's okay. And they know that there's going to be a network around them from that club, right? to support them and say, okay, you failed once, like, let's keep going, right? Versus you failed once, now you got to go get you got to pursue a different career, right? So I think it's the support system that's so important. I think that people need to recognize that and support that idea.
Andrew, that's a very rich answer, and there's so much in there to unpack. One of the things that I think is really critical too is this idea that I can fail at this, I can try something, I've got people around me that can help me. And there's another question that kind of goes right onto this, which says, from the perspective of people who are not in the club, what can they do to be part of the solution? And one of the things that I hear you saying too is this willingness to step forward and connect with those people who can help you to be part of a network that's willing to take you in is also a scary but important step, right? If I look around and say, wow, I could go, I'll use an example, to the Idea Center, but I don't see very many people there that look like me, and therefore I'm afraid to connect to that environment. How do we both make it welcoming for them, and they also have the courage to do that so that they can get access to all these networks and support systems? I'll just throw that out there as a question for all of you.
You know, I'll just take it really quickly. I think that conversations like this, where we're actually talking about action steps, right, and where people can see that the Notre Dame Idea Center is about that, right, I think is a big step, right? You have to recognize and admit that maybe you're not maybe you're not as involved as you think you are, right, in different circumstances. And I think that once you get to the point where you can kind of say, hey, we can do better, we're willing to have the conversations, I think people, might start to get more comfortable with going into an environment like the Idea Center and saying, okay, like, I at least know that these conversations are happening. They've recognized that me coming in as a Black entrepreneur might not be comfortable, might not be, I might be scared, et cetera. And I think it's kind of an acknowledgement of that being okay, because most entrepreneurs are are terrified of something, right, that's out there. And I think that this is not just, but it's another thing that we need to put into that kind of that basket of things that, scare the heck out of entrepreneurs, and say, when it comes to Black and brown entrepreneurs, this is something that might turn them off from this, and this is something that might scare them away. How do we move forward to address those things and be open to acknowledging that?
Yeah, and just so everyone is aware, I sent out my email address on the chat, the Q&A and the chat. And if you are an entrepreneur who wants to get connected into our ecosystem, we are actively looking for you. So send me an email. We don't care what people look like. I want women, minorities, anybody who wants to be connected to this ecosystem, we want to plug you in. So send me an email and we'll do all we can. We're biased towards technology companies, but that doesn't mean, I love Andrew's earlier point too, which was sometimes might not be the main entrepreneur today, but could be tomorrow. So come get connected to the system and we'll try to work and figure out where the best fits are. Marcus, I don't know if you have other ideas that you want to add, and then we'll go to Philip too for some comments.
I just want to add something to what Andrew said. I thought what Andrew just said was very important. One of the things that you notice in Silicon Valley is that investors feel more comfortable with co-founders rather than founders. In other words, what I mean by that is that investors are attracted to companies that are founded by teams of people rather than by one individual leader. An individual leader is gonna have their flaws, but teams tend to be able to compensate for the flaws of each other. And so a lot of investors are attracted to that type of founding situation. And that's another opportunity for an entree for minority and women entrepreneurs, is that they don't have to be the idea person. They can be a partner with the idea person.
Great point.
And that inclusivity and inclusive thinking is really important. I always say that, Brian, to your point of having everyone everyone welcome and everyone included, it's from that frame of who's not in the room.
Right.
And one of the things that in the systems change nature of how communities form and entrepreneurial communities form is making sure that everyone is in the room that should be in the room, and the awareness to who's missing and who's not there, and then why is that, and change that. And is that outreach? Is it understanding? Is it admitting? Whatever it is. You can have, I always say, you can have a diverse room. You can have an inclusive room. Doesn't mean it's an equitable room. So the E and DEI is the key one for me. An equal seat at the front table in belonging, in contributing, in being heard, and being respected. When those things can happen, interconnectivity, learning happens, change happens from that perspective, and keeping those things in mind when convening people and beginning to come up with an idea on something, make sure everyone's represented.
That's an awesome input. I mean, even thinking about it multidimensionally like that to really access the fullness of the human capital in the room, right? Everybody's brain, everyone's perspective. I think that's fantastic. Let me ask another very interesting question. It says, in the Boston area, there are some VC firms forming funds to invest exclusively in businesses owned by brown and black leaders. There's some, by the way, that are also doing this exclusively for women-owned ventures. Is this an effective way to start to include people in these ecosystems and these networks, or do we just create new ecosystems and networks that are disconnected?
Well, I think it's actually something, and thank you for the question. I'll start on this. Yes, the answer is yes, and trying out what are the new mechanisms. We're talking about systems change. So sometimes you might have to create a new system or go around it. We're doing the same thing, testing out something called the Capital Access Lab. Just drop that into the chat. But to answer the question, yes, I think because we talked about the systemic barriers, or however we want to refer to them, of how do we get capital to people that duly deserve it. And it taking too long, and the systems do we have 20 years to wait for certain systems to change, or even 1 year? So create ways to get capital to different groups. And we have to accelerate that. And our Capital Access Lab is trying out, it's a model, it's a test of a new mechanism. And so it's we put money into a donor advised fund, and that fund then is funding 5 fund managers who are funding diverse entrepreneurs and only. Mm-hmm. And so what we're doing is looking at that and saying, okay, let's look at that. Is this something that will work? And most of these funds, it's revenue-based models. And we hope that that's our learning on that will be something that we can share far and wide. We will share the learnings far and wide and see if this is something that's viable to do. Just trying to test something new and see what works.
Yeah. So I want to jump in and sound a little contrarian here. I'm hopeful that models like what's being tried in Boston will work, but I'm urging caution there, because we've got experience where people use the wrong criteria or basis for investing. And to give you an example, the solar power industry in California several years ago, the government decided it was a good idea to invest in solar power and invested in several companies that were not competitive, and they failed. It is, I think, important to seek out minority businesses and women-owned businesses, but at the end of the day, you have to make sure that they are competitive, and you're not selecting them simply because they are minority-owned or because they're owned by women. You have to select them because they are being missed by the market. They're being overlooked. They have to be real business opportunities. And I frankly trust private investors to make those decisions, because at the end of the day, they have a fiduciary duty to their investors to generate a return. So I'm cautiously optimistic that the efforts like that will work.
I love what you're saying there, Marcus, as a fund manager ourselves, who are actively looking for women and minority-owned businesses to invest in, but at the same time having a fiduciary responsibility to return to our limited partners. It puts all the more pressure on us to think about how we engage those folks early in our ecosystem and environment to make sure that they are competitive, right? And to your point, that they are co-founders with founders and that they're learning, to Andrew's point, all of the ins and outs of how entrepreneurship works and funding works. And as we all know, it's a complex environment. It's something that takes some time to come up that curve for anybody. So we need to think about how that happens. I appreciate that insight.
Yeah, I would just jump in a little bit and say, I think that's a really, really good point that Marcus made. At the end of the day, I think one of the things we focus on right at the Idea Centers is really, somebody might come in with an idea, right? And it might be a terrible idea, right? That happens a fair amount in the venture world, right? And it's kind of what you do from that point, right? Can you help that person to take the idea they had and shift it or pivot it so it might make a bit more sense, or it might be a bit more applicable? It's the ability to commercialize that product is a little bit better, right? I do agree that you have to. There's an aspect of this that where there needs to be the philanthropic side of it. I think when we talked about human capital and the sponsorship of individuals from a young age, right? But I think at the same time, it's a hard space, like entrepreneurship, venture, it's a hard space to be in, period, right? And I think that at the end of the day, like the initiative in Boston, I think that's great. I think it's a great thing, but I would agree that you're not doing anybody any favors if you are investing in their company just because they're Black,
right?
In my opinion. I think that the responsibility lies in actually making sure that they're positioning themselves in the best way possible, and then putting the resources behind them and the support and the network, right, is so important. I think that there's a lot of different factors, but I think you really have to, it really just comes back to early education and exposure, right? So when people of color get to that point, they know, right? They know, hey, I've got an idea that the market's missing right now, and thus there's a better chance that there's going to be investment and support and those sorts of things, but it has to start much earlier.
I love that idea that you get to the point where you really know you've got a de-risked idea that is worthy of that. And again, speaks to how important it is to be engaged in that ecosystem early.
Yeah.
Philip, did you have a comment?
I was just going to say, and with that, in doing that, we help change. One thing I think it needs to change is the perception, inherent thought. That is a deficit mentality versus an asset mentality when it comes to investing in women and people of color, Black people, people of color.
Yep. That
this notion that they're not as viable to succeed, they can't make the same type of money or return. Those are also those type of implicit biases that are there do create ideas around, alternative mechanisms of funding. Because we do hear a number of entrepreneurs that state that in surveys that we do. So I just want to add that.
No, that's a great point. And being cognizant of those biases and making sure that we're evaluating those openly is going to be really critical. One of the questions that we got here was, what are the specific things the Idea Center is doing to address this? I want to mention two things that we're really addressing, and then give each of the panelists a chance to make some final short comments, and then we'll wrap this up. Two things that we're doing. We are, as I mentioned before, aggressively moving towards working with school systems, whether they're charter schools or local school systems and districts, about how we create pipelines of entrepreneurship and STEM capacity, starting with kindergarten, moving through 12th grade with automatic access into Notre Dame. Lots of work to be done there. But what we're trying to do is create innovation fellowships within the Idea Center where people have been steeped in this knowledge and in these ecosystems and networks from a very young age. And yes, that might take us 20 years, but what I don't want to do is be having this discussion in 20 years, wishing we'd started 20 years earlier, right? So that's our long-term approach, and we're aggressively moving on that. So folks that want to help us, love to connect. The other thing we're doing is, if we have any strength at all at Notre Dame, it's our network. We have 750,000 alums worldwide. We have connections into virtually every major corporation, every major institution. And in our effort to create a local ecosystem, we can connect you with a worldwide ecosystem as well. So the mentorship thing that our panelists have talked about today is a critical focus of ours of success, connecting all entrepreneurs with the right mentors, the right advisors, the right board members, the right people with the right connections that can help them be successful as they go forward. So again, I invite you to come and connect with us so that we can help you connect with all of the right people that can help move this forward. Those are two specific action items that we're taking now, and happy to consider others as well. As we wrap up, I'm going to give each of you 2 minutes. Any final thoughts? Let's go in kind of reverse order. I'll go Marcus, and then Andrew, and then Philip, and then we'll wrap this up. Go ahead, Marcus.
So I appreciate the opportunity to be here on this panel. I just think that, Brian, you've just touched on the two most important things that we can do. Number one is that we have to create a pipeline of talent. We have to invest in our people. And number two is we have to have mentors who can pass knowledge along to the pipeline that we generate. It's not enough for us to create Black and brown kids with talent and education and skills if they are deprived of the access to mentorship and guidance that's really critical to success in small business. So hopefully we can have some impact, especially at Notre Dame, on creating that kind of environment.
Thank you, Marcus, and thanks for joining us today. It's great to have you. Andrew.
Yeah, would echo what Marcus said, and just this has been a great conversation, and I think that, you know, one of the things that I talked to Brian about before this panel, and when he was describing what we were doing, what the purpose of it was I wanted to know very, very specifically that this would be a conversation that led to action. And we discussed this before, you know, with Marcus and Philip, and I truly believe that what's happening at the Idea Center is completely based around action. What Brian is all about is action. So I'd say that first. But I would probably come back to a couple of things. You know, I think it at the end of the day, it comes down to education, exposure, mentorship. And to Marcus's point, you know, you need to develop that pipeline, you know, so targeted funding for specific individuals, for schools, for workshops, for scholarships that start at the beginning, that start in kindergarten, is just so huge to then take that person, you know, through their life up to the point at which they're going to college, right? And have them be in a position where they've been learning about the game, they've been learning about the club, they've been, you know, creating their own network as a result of people who are willing to give them that access and give them that guidance. And I think the last thing I would say is that, as I kind of mentioned before, this is a time for a lot of conversations. It's a time for action. I think it's a time where there's going to be a ton of different ways to meaningfully participate in society as an entrepreneur, because of all the transformations that are gonna have to happen as a result of the pandemic and everything else that's going on. And so I would say that for all the VCs listening, for the entrepreneurs that have companies, that are thinking about starting companies, but actually at the VCs, right? So at the VCs, you just have to do it, right? It comes down to, I said it earlier, you got to put your money where your mouth is. and say, we're going to do this. We're going to support action. And we're going to do that with dollars in the way that we would for, a white entrepreneur. And so I think that until you just do it and stop talking about it and stop complaining about the fact that everybody's mad at you because you're not, that's because it's a conscious decision. And so if you make a conscious decision to take action, it'll become very clear very quickly who's doing that and who's not. And I think the folks that do that will benefit greatly, and will also be doing really, really good work.
Fantastic. Thanks, Andrew. Philip.
This is why you never follow an entrepreneur.
Right.
That should have been
the last word, right? We should have given Andrew the last word.
Following Marcus and Andrew. Okay. Look, I think our founder, Ewing Marion Kaufman, had a wonderful quote. All the money in the world cannot solve problems unless we work together. And if we work together, there's no problem in the world that can stop us. So I go back to the interdependence theme, and a little bit of a theme from what Andrew was just saying. This is a moment in time that doesn't come very often. The tectonic plate shifting that we have out there, and maybe once in 100 years, you got to grab onto times like this that are, there are hard times. They're hard for so many people. We're losing people. But, there's a door opening as well. And this is the time, if you don't know how to jump in, if you don't know how to change, if you don't think you can make a difference, if you haven't liked the conversation, this is the time to say, I don't have the answer. I need help. I want to help. How do I do it? Or, study and find a way to do it. This is a golden opportunity time for us to make sure that we all thrive, and everyone can take from an idea and make it a reality, an economic reality.
Thank you, Philip. Thank you to all of our participants, Andrew, Philip, Marcus. Really appreciate you being with us today, having a very tough and open and productive conversation. For all of you listening, these proceedings will be on a podcast that you can find wherever you get your podcasts, and also on our website at ideacenter.nd.edu, and should be available very soon. And as is also the questions. And again, we invite you, if you want to be a part of what we're doing, to please engage. And we look forward to hearing from you. Again, thank you all for participating, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.